The first thing I noticed wasn't the bulldozers, it was the music. Country music drifted across thousands of acres that should have been silent except for cattle, wind, and coyotes. Then I saw golf carts. Perfect green fairways, a massive stone clubhouse flying an HOA flag I had never seen before. And then a deputy stepped in front of my truck, hand resting on his holster. "Sir, this is private HOA property. You're gonna have to turn around." I looked past him at the land stretching to the horizon. Land my grandfather had worked until the day he died. Land I had inherited 6 days earlier. Land that somehow now had a country club sitting in the middle of it. I reached into my glove box, pulled out the probate papers, and asked one question that changed hundreds of lives. "Deputy, if this is HOA property, why does my name appear on every deed in your county records?" The smile disappeared from his face. That was only the beginning. "My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, born and raised outside Fredericksburg, Texas. My family had ranched the same land for 4 generations, though most people around town had forgotten that because my grandfather, Walter Walker, preferred living quietly instead of bragging about what he owned. Granddad used to tell me something every summer. Land doesn't care who thinks they're powerful. Paperwork decides everything. Back then, I thought he was talking about cattle permits or tax forms. Years later, I realized he was teaching me how people really stole property. Not with guns, with signatures. For almost 15 years I worked as a civil engineer in Houston. Long hours. Good money, barely any vacations. Granddad refused to leave the ranch. "I've got fences to fix," he'd always say. Even when he was 84. Then one cold November morning my phone rang while I was sitting in a traffic jam. Walter Walker had passed away peacefully in his sleep. 3 days later I stood beside his weathered red barn, surrounded by neighbors who remembered when the ranch stretched farther than the eye could see. Some cried, some shook my hand. Others avoided looking me in the eyes. At the time, I assumed they were simply grieving. Now I know many of them were hiding something. After the funeral, Granddad's attorney, Margaret Collins, asked me to stay behind. She was in her 60s, always wearing navy blue suits, silver framed glasses, and carrying leather folders so organized they looked untouched. She opened a thick envelope. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions." Inside was a handwritten letter. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then I'm finally resting. Don't sell. Don't lease. Don't trust anyone who suddenly acts friendly. Before making any decisions, walk every acre yourself. Especially the south boundary, you'll understand. Love, Granddad." I laughed softly. Margaret didn't. "There are also these." She placed 12 property deeds across the table. I blinked. 12. The ranch wasn't one property. She smiled faintly. It was 12 adjoining parcels accumulated over 60 years. I spent the next hour reading legal descriptions that sounded endless. 9,400 acres. 9,400. I knew the ranch was large. I never imagined it was that large. Margaret leaned forward. "Your grandfather intentionally kept ownership quiet." "Why?" "He believed attention creates greed." Those words stayed with me. The following week I packed my apartment in Houston, resigned from my engineering firm, and drove west for good. The ranch looked exactly as I remembered. The white farmhouse, the old red barn, miles of cedar fencing, oak trees scattered across rolling hills, 3 ponds, hundreds of cattle. Everything felt frozen in time, except one thing, the southern horizon. At sunset I noticed lights, lots of lights, too many lights. Granddad had always said nobody lived within several miles of that pasture. So why were there stadium-style floodlights glowing against the evening sky? The next morning I saddled one of Granddad's horses instead of taking the truck. Old habits die hard. As I rode south I noticed fresh tire tracks, heavy equipment, concrete trucks, utility vehicles. The farther I traveled, the stranger everything became. Fresh pavement, brand new landscaping, decorative stone walls. Then I reached a wrought iron entrance nearly 20 feet tall. It read, "Silver Mesa Country Estates. Members only." Beyond it stood luxury homes worth millions, perfect lawns. Palm trees that definitely didn't belong in this part of Texas. A massive clubhouse overlooked an 18-hole golf course. Luxury SUVs lined the parking lot. People wearing expensive golf shirts laughed on patios overlooking land I had hunted deer on as a teenager. I honestly wondered if I'd crossed onto someone else's property by mistake. Then I saw the old oak tree. The one Granddad carved our initials into 25 years earlier. It stood beside the 10th fairway. There was no mistake. They had built everything on Walker Ranch. A security guard drove toward me in a white SUV. "Morning." "This morning you can't ride horses in here."
"One where?"
"Whoa!" I chuckled. "No, Silver Mesa HOA." I pointed toward the oak tree. "How long has this been here?" "About 4 years. 4 years. Granddad never mentioned any of this, not once. "I'd like to speak with whoever's in charge." He handed me a business card. "Rebecca Holloway." "Oh, President." I rode back to the ranch in complete silence. Margaret answered on the second ring. "There shouldn't be a neighborhood on my land." Silence. Then, "What did you just say?" "I found nearly 100 homes and a country club." Another pause. "Stay where you are." 3 hours later, she arrived carrying boxes filled with surveys, tax maps, and deeds. We spread everything across Granddad's dining room table. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "This can't be right." "What?" She laid 2 surveys side by side. One was dated 18 years earlier, the other only 5 years old. The property lines were different, not slightly, massively. Nearly 2,000 acres had somehow shifted into neighboring parcels. "That's impossible," I whispered. "It should be." She frowned. "But this newer survey references amendments I've never seen." "Fraud?" "I don't know yet." She immediately called the county clerk. By evening, we had another surprise. The digital county map showed the HOA occupying land that legally belonged to Silver Mesa Development Company. The original paper deeds still showed Walker Ranch, two completely different ownership records. Margaret slowly closed the laptop. I've practiced property law for 36 years. I've never seen this. The next morning we drove to the county courthouse. The clerk looked nervous the moment Margaret introduced herself. We need every filing involving Walker Ranch over the past 10 years. She disappeared into the records room. 25 minutes later she returned empty-handed. I'm sorry. The files are unavailable. Margaret folded her arms. Unavailable. They've been requested. By whom? I can't disclose that. Margaret calmly placed her business card on the counter. You have 1 hour before I file an emergency preservation order. The clerk swallowed hard. 40 minutes later she returned carrying 4 dusty archive boxes. Someone had hidden them. That much was obvious. Inside we found dozens of easement filings, road agreements, utility permits, drainage approvals, construction permits. Every document referenced land that supposedly belonged to Silver Mesa Development. None included Walter Walker's signature. None. Margaret looked ready to explode. They built an entire community without the owner's consent. How? I don't know. But someone inside county government helped. As we left the courthouse, a black luxury SUV waited across the street. A woman stepped out wearing an expensive white blazer and designer sunglasses. She smiled as though we were old friends. Ethan Walker.
Wes.
She extended her hand. Rebecca Holloway, the HOA president. She was in her early 50s. Perfectly styled blonde hair, confident smile, polished cowboy boots that had clearly never touched real mud. I've been hoping we'd finally meet. I imagine you have. She laughed politely. I understand finding all this must be overwhelming. You built a country club on my ranch. It's a little more complicated than that. I doubt it. She removed her sunglasses. Would you allow me to explain over lunch? Margaret answered before I could. No. Rebecca's smile barely changed. Our attorneys have reviewed everything, so have ours. Rebecca looked directly at me. Mr. Walker, your grandfather supported this community. My grandfather never mentioned it. He didn't need to. Margaret stepped closer. Can you produce a signed agreement? Rebecca hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. But I noticed. Our legal department handles those records. Margaret smiled. Rebecca's pleasant expression cooled. I'd encourage you not to make accusations you can't prove. And I'd encourage you not to build on land you don't own. The people walking nearby had started watching. Rebecca noticed too. She leaned closer until only I could hear her. Sometimes old landowners don't understand progress. I looked toward the clubhouse standing on my family's pasture. My grandfather understood ownership. She smiled again. This conversation isn't over. She climbed back into the SUV and drove away. Margaret watched until the vehicle disappeared. She lied. You sure? I've spent 30 years questioning witnesses. She expected you to believe documents exist, but they don't. That evening I decided to follow Granddad's final instruction. Walk every acre, especially the south boundary. Just before sunset I reached an old barbed wire fence almost hidden by mesquite trees. There, nailed to a weathered cedar post, I found something wrapped inside an oilcloth bag. It was dry despite years outside. Inside were handwritten notes, old photographs, survey stakes, and a small brass key taped to a folded piece of paper. Across the top, in Granddad's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 chilling words. If they've started building, don't trust anyone. For a long minute, I just stood there staring at my grandfather's handwriting. The sun was dropping behind the cedar trees, turning the entire pasture orange, but I couldn't move. Granddad had known. Not just suspected. Known. The oilcloth bag contained nearly 40 photographs. Most showed the southern pasture years before construction ever started. Every fence corner, every creek crossing, every survey marker had been photographed from different angles. On the back of each picture, Granddad had written dates and GPS coordinates. The final photograph stopped me cold. It showed 3 men pulling up one of his original iron survey monuments with a backhoe. One of the men wore a reflective county survey vest. Another wore a hard hat with the Silver Mesa Development logo. The third man, I recognized him immediately. County Commissioner Daniel Brooks. My grandfather had written only one sentence beneath the picture. They thought I wasn't watching. I hurried back to the ranch house where Margaret was still sorting through courthouse records. Without saying a word, I spread the photographs across the kitchen table. Her eyes widened. Where did you find these? South boundary. She carefully picked up the photograph of Commissioner Brooks. Oh, my. You know him. I've argued cases in front of him for years. She looked back at me. If this picture is authentic, this isn't just civil fraud anymore. What is it? Conspiracy. Neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, Margaret arranged an emergency meeting with a licensed independent surveyor named Thomas Reed. Thomas was 62, lean, sunburned, with gray hair tucked beneath a faded tan cowboy hat. He drove an old white Ford F-250 that looked older than I was. He spent 20 minutes examining Granddad's photographs. Finally, he nodded. These are original state monuments. You sure? I installed some of them myself 23 years ago. He pointed toward one picture. This marker legally can't be moved. But it was. Then somebody committed a felony. He looked at me with complete seriousness. Mr. Walker, if your grandfather documented this correctly, someone didn't steal a few acres. They stole thousands. Thomas slowly folded the photographs back into their envelope. We're going to resurvey every inch. That afternoon we started at the northern boundary. Everything matched the original deeds perfectly. The eastern boundary, perfect. The western boundary, also perfect. Then we reached the south. Thomas stopped walking. His GPS unit beeped repeatedly. This fence shouldn't be here. He walked another 100 yards, then another. Finally, he planted a bright orange stake into the ground. No question. What? We're standing almost 2,000 feet inside your property. I looked toward the beautifully maintained golf course. You mean the clubhouse? He nodded. The parking lot. Another nod. The tennis courts, also yours. My stomach tightened. They built an entire luxury development inside your boundary. Before I could answer, 3 black SUVs came racing across the golf course. They stopped less than 20 feet away. Rebecca Holloway climbed out first. Behind her came 2 HOA board members wearing matching navy jackets embroidered with the Silver Mesa logo. One was Richard Sloan, a retired real estate developer in his late 60s. The other was Denise Carter, a former banking executive with perfectly styled silver hair. Rebecca smiled like we were attending a neighborhood barbecue. Good afternoon. Thomas ignored her and continued recording measurements. Rebecca's smile faded. What exactly are you doing? Thomas answered without looking up. State certified boundary verification. Rebecca crossed her arms. You don't have permission. Thomas finally looked at her. I don't need permission to survey private property. This isn't private property, he calmly pointed toward me. According to every original deed in county records, it belongs to Mr. Walker. The color drained from Richard Sloan's face. Rebecca recovered quickly. Our attorneys disagree, and Margaret stepped forward. They're welcome to explain that under oath. No one spoke. Thomas hammered another survey stake into the ground. The metallic sound echoed across the golf course. Rebecca turned toward me. You're making a think so. You have no idea how many families live here. I know exactly where they live. She lowered her voice. If this continues, property values will collapse. I stared at the clubhouse. My grandfather's property value already collapsed. She had no answer. Instead, she climbed back into her SUV. As they drove away, Thomas quietly muttered, "They're scared. How can you tell?" They stopped arguing about facts. They're arguing about consequences. That evening, my phone started ringing. The first caller introduced himself as a homeowner inside Silver Mesa. I just heard you're claiming the neighborhood. I'm claiming my ranch. My wife is terrified. I understand. We bought our house legally. I hope you did. There was a long silence. Then he asked the question I couldn't answer. If you're right, what happens to us? I honestly didn't know. By the following morning, local news trucks were parked outside my ranch gate. Someone had leaked the survey. Headlines exploded across Texas. Masses Tams La Ukizurya Ryan Sartirshire Kuantiri Silo Bsiso Anfem Iolande. Within hours, reporters were requesting interviews. I declined every one. Margaret insisted we stay quiet. They'll destroy themselves if we let them. She was right. That afternoon, Rebecca held a press conference outside the clubhouse. Standing behind a polished podium, she smiled confidently. There is absolutely no legal uncertainty regarding Silver Mesa. We remain fully operational. Our attorneys are confident. What? A reporter raised his hand. What about the independent survey? Rebecca barely blinked. We believe it contains serious errors. Another reporter asked, did Walter Walker ever sign development approval? Rebecca paused, only briefly. Our legal department maintains complete documentation. Margaret muted the television. She's bluffing. You still think there aren't any documents? If they had them, she would have held them up for every camera. The following day, Thomas finished the complete survey. He laid the final map across my dining table. Everyone fell silent. The bright red boundary line cut directly through the middle of the golf course. Clubhouse, swimming pools, maintenance buildings, main entrance, luxury homes. Everything west of the line belonged to Walker Ranch. Nearly 140 homes. I looked at Thomas. This is wrong. He shook his head. I'd stake my license on it. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. Then it's time. Time for what? She looked directly at me. File. Within 24 hours, our lawsuit filled nearly 600 pages. It named Silver Mesa HOA, Silver Mesa Development Company, County Commissioner Daniel Brooks, unknown county employees, and anyone involved in altering property records. The courthouse clerk looked nervous when we submitted it. So, this is really happening. Margaret simply replied, it already happened. 3 days later, the judge signed an emergency preservation order. No more construction. No land transfers. No document destruction. Every county record connected to Walker Ranch was frozen. The reaction was immediate. Developers started calling homeowners. Homeowners started calling banks. Banks started calling attorneys. Nobody knew who actually owned what anymore. Then something happened that none of us expected. Late Friday night, my security cameras picked up movement near the south pasture. 3 pickup trucks. No headlights. 4 men climbed over my fence carrying shovels. I grabbed my flashlight and drove out there. By the time I arrived, they were digging beside one of Thomas's fresh survey stakes. Hey! They froze. One man threw something into the truck bed. Another jumped behind the wheel. They sped away before I could read the license plate. When I inspected the hole, my blood ran cold. They had dug directly where one of Granddad's original iron monuments should have been, but they were too late. Thomas had already removed it for evidence. Someone was trying to erase history. The next morning, I handed the security footage to Sheriff Hank Morales. Sheriff Morales was 56, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin, a thick gray mustache, and the calm voice of a man who had spent decades breaking up bad situations. He watched the footage twice. Interesting. You recognize anybody? Not clearly. He leaned back. But I recognize the trucks. You do. They belong to a contractor working for Silver Mesa. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. I'm opening an investigation. As I stood to leave, he stopped me. Ethan.
Yeah, watch your back. I smiled.
You think they'll threaten me?
He looked me straight in the eye.
I think they're desperate. 2 nights later, I found out exactly how desperate. At 20:17 a.m., every light inside the ranch house suddenly went dark. Power outage. At first, I assumed a transformer had failed. Then my backup generator refused to start. That had never happened before. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The silence felt wrong. Then I heard engines, several of them, coming from the southern gate. When I reached the hill overlooking the entrance, my flashlight revealed a line of vehicles. Construction equipment, bulldozers, excavators, concrete trucks, and nearly a dozen sheriff's deputies. One deputy stepped forward holding official paperwork. Mr. Walker. Yes, we've been instructed to secure this property. I stared at him. Secure it. He unfolded the document. By order of the court pending ownership review, every gate leading into the disputed property is being locked until further notice. I looked past him. Deputies were already wrapping heavy chains around every entrance to my own ranch. The south gate, the east gate, the county road access, even the old cattle crossing. Then I saw Rebecca Holloway standing beside the clubhouse parking lot, watching everything with a satisfied smile. Rebecca Holloway didn't wave, she didn't smile. She simply stood beside the clubhouse with her arms crossed while deputies finished locking every entrance to my family's ranch. Heavy steel chains rattled as thick padlocks clicked shut. I walked straight toward the deputy holding the paperwork. You're locking me out of my own property. He shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the order says we're preserving the status quo until the court hears emergency arguments. I took the papers from his hands. Margaret had taught me to read every line before reacting. Halfway down the page, something immediately caught my attention. The judge's signature looked genuine. The case number was genuine. But one sentence wasn't. It stated that Silver Mesa Development Company was in exclusive possession of the disputed property. I looked up. Who drafted this order? The deputy shook his head. I honestly don't know. You should? Before he could answer, Sheriff Hank Morales drove through the north entrance. He stepped out of his truck carrying the same document. His eyebrows narrowed after only a few seconds. Who handed this to my deputies? One lieutenant answered. It came directly from the courthouse. Sheriff Morales looked at the wording again. Then he looked at me. Ethan, something isn't right. What do you mean? This isn't the preservation order the judge signed yesterday. Margaret arrived less than 20 minutes later. She barely glanced at the paperwork before saying the same thing. This has been altered. Rebecca finally walked over. I think everyone should calm down. Margaret turned toward her. Did your attorneys submit a revised order? Our legal team follows the law. That wasn't my question. Rebecca's smile returned. I believe the court wanted clarity. Margaret laughed. The court wanted honesty. By sunrise the next morning, Margaret had already filed an emergency motion demanding the judge review the order in person. The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. Word spread through the county faster than wildfire. By the time I reached the courthouse, television vans filled every parking space. Reporters crowded the entrance. Homeowners from Silver Mesa stood beside lifelong ranchers. Developers whispered to attorneys. County employees avoided eye contact. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered exactly on time. She was known across 3 counties for one thing. She hated dishonesty. She adjusted her glasses. I understand there is disagreement regarding an emergency preservation order. Margaret stood. Your Honor, there isn't disagreement. There are 2 different orders. A quiet murmur spread across the courtroom. Margaret handed both documents to the bailiff. The judge compared them side by side. Within seconds, her expression changed. She looked toward the clerk. Who filed this second version? Nobody answered. Judge Hayes asked again, this time louder. Who filed it? The courtroom remained silent. Finally, the county clerk slowly stood. Arrived electronically. From whom? I don't know. Judge Hayes looked furious. I assure you, before today ends, we're going to find out. Rebecca shifted in her chair. For the first time since we'd met, she looked nervous. The judge immediately suspended enforcement of every locked gate. Until ownership is determined, Mr. Walker will have unrestricted access to all property described in his deeds. Rebecca's attorney jumped to his feet. Your Honor, she cut him off. Sit down. He sat outside the courthouse. Deputies began removing chains from every ranch entrance. Rebecca watched from across the parking lot without saying a word. Sheriff Morales walked beside me. You just won the first round. It doesn't feel like winning. He nodded toward the crowd of homeowners. They're scared. I looked across the street. Families stood together holding property folders. Some were crying. Children had no idea why television cameras surrounded their neighborhood. One older man approached me carefully. My name's Frank. I shook his hand. Why, I bought our home 8 years ago. I know. If what you're saying is true, we never wanted this. I believe you. His wife stepped forward. Please don't hate us. That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. They weren't the ones who moved survey markers. They weren't the ones who changed county maps. Most of them were victims too. That evening, Margaret called with surprising news. 3 people want to meet you. Ooh, former Silver Mesa employees. They're willing to talk? They're terrified. We met inside an old barbecue restaurant 30 miles away. The first man introduced himself as Kevin Marsh. He had managed construction crews during the early phases of the development. The second was a retired equipment operator named Luis Ortega. The third caught my attention immediately. She was a former administrative assistant for Silver Mesa Development. Her name was Emily Sanders. Emily kept looking over her shoulder before speaking. I don't have much time. Margaret placed a recorder on the table. Tell us what you know. Emily took a deep breath. The original development plans didn't include your land. I leaned forward. What changed? About 5 years into planning, the investors realized they couldn't build the golf course. Why not? They didn't own enough acreage. Kevin nodded. That's true. Emily continued. Then Commissioner Brooks started arranging private meetings. With who? Rebecca's name came next. So did Rebecca Holloway. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Emily opened a folder she'd carried under her coat. Inside were photocopies of internal emails, purchase maps, construction schedules, meeting agendas. One email had a subject line that made my stomach Lian Biafora Funil Surv. Margaret read it twice, then 3 times. Kevin were told new monuments would be installed overnight. Lewis quietly added, they paid us cash. For what? Digging? What exactly? The old survey markers. No one spoke for several seconds. Emily finally whispered, everybody knew? Except your grandfather. I slowly shook my head. No. He knew. I pulled Granddad's photographs from my backpack. Emily's eyes filled with tears. He photographed us. He photographed everything. Margaret carefully gathered every document. This changes the entire case. Kevin looked toward the restaurant windows. They'll know we talked. Sheriff Morales had quietly entered through the back door 20 minutes earlier. He finally stepped forward. No, they'll know I know. The room fell silent. Sheriff Morales looked at each witness. From this moment, you're under witness protection ordered by my office. Emily looked relieved for the first time all evening. As we walked outside, my phone vibrated. It was Thomas Reed, the surveyor. Ethan. His voice sounded different. Panicked. I went back to verify one last monument. It isn't there.
What?
Neither is the ground around it.
I froze.
What do you mean? They excavated the entire area. When? Today. Ooh, I don't know. But there's something else. What? Thomas took a slow breath. I found a fresh concrete foundation. My heartbeat sped up. Foundation for what? They're building something. On the exact place where the original state monument stood, I looked toward Sheriff Morales. He could tell from my face that something was wrong. What is it? I lowered the phone. They're trying to bury the evidence before the next hearing. Sheriff Morales didn't waste a second. Within 15 minutes, 3 patrol units, Thomas Reed, Margaret Collins, and I were bouncing down the gravel road toward the southern boundary. The sky was turning dark, and floodlights illuminated a construction site that hadn't existed that morning. Fresh concrete had already been poured. Steel rebar stuck out of the ground like skeleton fingers. A contractor hurried toward us. This is an active construction zone. Sheriff Morales held up his badge. Not anymore. The workers immediately shut down their equipment. Thomas walked straight to the center of the fresh slab. He checked his GPS twice. Then he looked at me. This is it. The original state monument is directly beneath this concrete. Margaret slowly smiled. They've just destroyed evidence in the middle of a pending lawsuit. Sheriff Morales turned toward his deputies. Nobody leaves. Every worker was identified, interviewed, and their equipment secured. One nervous foreman finally admitted they had received a last-minute order that morning. Who gave it? Sheriff Morales asked. He swallowed hard. A board member from Silver Mesa. Which one? Richard Sloan. That single statement changed everything. By sunrise, news helicopters circled above the ranch. Every major station in Texas was broadcasting live. The headline flashing across every screen read, NWDNCA Messi EOA Land Dispute. At noon, Judge Eleanor Hayes ordered an emergency evidentiary hearing. The courtroom was overflowing. Homeowners filled every seat. Reporters lined the walls. Even neighboring county officials had shown up. Margaret stood first. Your Honor, we intend to prove this wasn't a surveying mistake. It was an organized effort to seize nearly 2,000 acres. Thomas Reed was the first witness. Using aerial maps, original surveys, and GPS data, he showed exactly where every legal monument had been installed decades earlier. Then he displayed photographs taken by my grandfather. The courtroom became silent. The final photograph showed Commissioner Daniel Brooks standing beside heavy equipment as an original survey marker was being removed. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Commissioner Brooks, is that you? He hesitated, then quietly answered, yes, but that's not what it looks like. Margaret smiled. Then please explain what it looks like. He couldn't. Next came Emily Sanders. Her hands shook as she testified, but her voice never broke. She described the private meetings, the altered development plans, the instructions to move the south line. Then she identified every person who attended those meetings. Rebecca Holloway, Richard Sloan, Commissioner Brooks, executives from Silver Mesa Development. Margaret introduced the internal emails, bank records, construction schedules, cash payment logs. Each document fit perfectly with the next. The defense attorneys objected repeatedly. Judge Hayes overruled nearly every objection. Then Sheriff Morales took the stand. He described the altered court order, the attempted removal of survey monuments, the overnight concrete pour after the lawsuit had been filed. Finally, he looked directly at Rebecca Holloway. I've investigated crimes for 31 years. This wasn't confusion. It was coordination. Rebecca lowered her eyes for the first time. The defense made one final attempt. Their lead attorney argued that innocent homeowners would suffer if the court ruled against Silver Mesa. Judge Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Agree? She looked toward me. Mr. Walker, please stand. I stood. If ownership is confirmed in your favor, what remedy are you seeking? Every homeowner watched me. Some looked terrified. Others simply looked exhausted. I remembered the elderly couple who had begged me not to hate them. I remembered the children riding bicycles through streets they believed were theirs. None of them had moved a single survey marker. I took a deep breath. I'm not here to punish families. The courtroom became completely still. I'm here to hold the people responsible accountable. Margaret smiled softly. I continued, I'll negotiate legal easements, fair purchases, or long-term agreements with every homeowner acting in good faith. But the developers will look directly at Rebecca. Don't deserve another square inch. Several homeowners quietly wiped away tears. Even Judge Hayes seemed moved. 3 weeks later, the court issued its final ruling. The written opinion was over 100 pages long. Its conclusion was unmistakable. The original Walker Ranch deeds were valid. The altered surveys were declared fraudulent. Every unauthorized property transfer based on those surveys was void. Silver Mesa Development was ordered to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, legal costs, restoration expenses, and penalties. The case was immediately referred for criminal prosecution. Commissioner Daniel Brooks resigned that afternoon before being arrested on charges related to public corruption and evidence tampering. Richard Sloan was taken into custody after investigators uncovered additional financial records. Rebecca Holloway was removed as HOA president and later faced multiple felony charges tied to fraud, conspiracy, and filing false public records. The developers who had believed they were untouchable left the courthouse through a side entrance surrounded by investigators. Over the following year, my life changed in ways I never expected. Working with the court, we created agreements that allowed honest homeowners to remain in their homes while fairly compensating Walker Ranch for the land involved. The golf course was reduced in size to fit within legally acquired property. Parts of the former clubhouse became a county agricultural education center honoring local ranching history. The old oak tree with my grandfather's initials was protected by court order. No one would ever touch it again. One cool autumn morning, I rode my horse across the southern pasture. The fences had been rebuilt. The cattle grazed peacefully. Wind rolled through the tall grass exactly as it had when I was a boy. I stopped beside the restored original survey monument. Someone had polished the brass marker until it shined in the morning sun. At its base lay a small bouquet of wildflowers. There was no note. It didn't need one. I removed my hat and smiled. Granddad had been right all along. Land doesn't care who thinks they're powerful. Paperwork decides everything. But only when someone has the courage to defend the truth behind it. As I turned my horse toward the red barn, the first rays of sunrise spread across all 400 acres that had carried my family's name for generations. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I wasn't looking at a battlefield. I was looking at home. The gates were open again, and this time everyone finally knew who held the keys.